This is the guidance film then for the next lesson in your Cold War GCSE studies. We've already looked at the deteriorating situation of the Cold War as the relationship between the West, dominated by America, capitalist and democratic, is getting considerably worse against the Soviet Union in the East, communist and a dictatorship. Today the lesson is going to focus on how the country of Germany, divided at the end of the Second World War, will now split into two more permanent countries to replace that temporary arrangement that existed at the end of the war. These two countries will be known as West Germany and East Germany, or FDR and the GDR. So, the summary of the story so far. We understand the power of nuclear weapons, and at this point in the story, only the United States possesses those nuclear weapons. These weapons render a war unwinnable, certainly if both sides possess those weapons. Secondly, we understand the importance of ideology, and that is that the two sides both view each other with hostility and cannot understand each other. We know that during the Second World War, the relationship between the big three countries involved would change as the war progressed, depending on how likely it was that the war was going to be won or lost. The three big countries would meet on three occasions, once at Tehran in 1943, which was very productive, again at Yalta, which was considerably less productive because Hitler's defeat was now almost certain, and then finally in 1945 they would meet in Berlin at Potsdam when Hitler had been defeated, and this would be the least successful of the meetings. And if you remember, Roosevelt and Churchill were no longer there, replaced by Truman, the president in our story now, and Attlee, who had replaced Churchill. After World War II, Europe would now be divided between these two different sides, the American West and the Soviet East. The boundary between the two would be known as the Iron Curtain, and Europe and the world would be split into the United States and her allies versus the Soviet Union and her allies. Both the USA and USSR would support their friends and mistrust the other side. As a consequence of ideology, the Long and Novikov telegrams that we've already looked at, and then the Americans and the help that they gave people in the West would help Western Europe recover, and this was the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine that you studied last time. The Cold War is getting colder. Now, as this is played, what I would like you to do is attempt to unscramble these words. There's no need to write them down, but what you need to do is you need to be able to understand each of the words and the significance of each. I'll reveal each of the words in turn, and then I'll have the teacher pause it, and then you can figure out what the words are, and then they can be fed back to the class. If the teacher can pause this now for a minute to let the students unscramble the words. So going through each of these in turn now, I would strongly suggest if you do not know what these words are or do not understand their significance, that you write them down and you be proactive, maybe on the back of your booklets in green pen. Number one then is Potsdam. That was the conference, the third of the conferences between the leaders in 1945 and the least productive one. Yalta in 1945, earlier in 1945, this had been the meeting where the three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, had decided upon the fate of Germany. Truman, the president who would succeed Franklin Roosevelt after his death in 1945. And the Cold War given to the relations between the East and the West, the Soviets and the Americans. Number 5 is Tehran, the 1943 conference held when Germany's defeat was certainly not predicted, and therefore the meeting where all three sides needed each other the most. The United Nations, at both Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam, all of the three nations promised to set up this organisation to police the world after the end of World War II. The long telegram written by George Kennan explaining his interpretation of the Soviet Union and her position in the world and her intentions. 8. The Novikov telegram, written slightly later. Nikolai Novikov, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, wrote his interpretation of America and her intentions and fed them back to Stalin. The Truman Doctrine. Truman's promise to contain the spread of communism. This was to be done through money and military assistance, but not American soldiers. The promise was to contain the Soviet Union. And finally, number 10, following the limited success of the Truman Doctrine and the very harsh winters of 1946 and 1947, America pours billions of dollars of aid into Europe in order to rebuild Europe, believing that prosperous people are far more likely to want to remain in democracies. This is the aid that Western Europe accepted, but the Soviet Union forbid Eastern European countries to accept. And this would further divide Europe into a more prosperous West and a poorer and consequently more jealous East. You can pause here if students wish to reflect. So today's lesson. You're now going to need to study the division of Germany and the division of the capital of Germany, Berlin. And to that end, you have this diagram in your booklet. What I'm going to need you to do is annotate this as we go through, and this is going to be one of those go-to pages in your booklet in order to keep coming back to in order to understand what is going on in the story. So far, we've looked at a divided continent. We've looked at the divided continent of Europe. But now what we're going to do is look at the divided city of Berlin and the divided country of Germany. This is the country that Hitler had ruled, and this is the country that had been squeezed between the British and the Americans in the West and the Soviet Union in the East. At Yalta in 1945, they agreed upon a partition of Germany. So that's a word that needs to be written down around the side of this diagram, the partition of Germany. And Germany would be divided up into 4 zones. These would be known as zones of occupation. Now we'll go through these, and hopefully this can be annotated and written on the board at the same time as we go through this. The Americans were going to take the zone in the north, the British in the middle, and the French in the south. The zone in the east was going to be occupied by the Soviets. This map, as you can probably tell, isn't done to scale, nor is it an accurate reflection of Germany. These zones in the west will eventually be unified to form West Germany, whereas the zone in the east will eventually become East Germany. Now, although the big three were able to decide that they wanted to divide Germany into these zones of occupation, they were never able to decide on what would happen afterwards. And following the decision to partition Germany into these zones, as you know, relations got worse and worse, and consequently no decision was made. So we have Germany split into 4 zones, which will eventually become 2 countries. Berlin makes the matter more complex again. Berlin, the capital of Germany, is located here, right in the middle of the eastern zone of Germany. But Berlin was to be partitioned exactly the same way as Germany was. And therefore, we have Germany and Berlin split into 4 zones. The American zone, the British zone, and the French zone, and a Russian zone. These will become known collectively as West Berlin, and this is East Berlin. Now, aware that Berlin is surrounded by the Soviet zone of occupation, it was agreed that there would be road links, rail links, and air links for the West to be able to supply West Berlin. Please note that West Berlin would have accepted and did accept millions of dollars in Marshall aid money. The East did not. Therefore, West Berlin will become a symbol of capitalism and democracy right in the middle of East Germany. As Marshall aid money helps West Berlin rebuild itself, West Berlin will become a symbol of the success of capitalism and democracy when contrasted with East Berlin. For the next few lessons, Germany and Berlin will become the focus of the Cold War. Germany is the Cold War in one tiny place. The whole story is played out here. You need to make sure that your map has been labelled. I'll pause again here. Now, using the information in your books, what I would like you now to do is read the information that you have been provided with and complete the profile questions on the final page, identifying the key information about both of these countries.